Welcome back. We are on part 4 of our workshop, focusing on this concept of inquiry and how we can be applying inquiry into our lessons, and especially be thinking about how we can look for inquiry in our standards. What should standards look like when we are focusing on this concept of inquiry? And today's part is really going to focus on the disciplinary concepts that we work with. So, be thinking about our civics concepts, geography, history, and economics. Those will be the big 4 we're going to look at. And we're going to be really thinking of what concepts in those 4 disciplines need to be in our standards, and we're just going to be workshopping a little bit and seeing how that might look like when we're actually lesson planning. Alright, so we're back in our C3 framework now. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to our table of contents. Skip all this introduction stuff. And we're right here in Dimension 2, applying disciplinary concepts and tools. And we see that we have our 4 chief, or 4 core disciplines: civics, economics, geography, and history. And those are really the 4 disciplines that we focus on in South Dakota. There is an appendix with other disciplines that typically are in the social studies, like sociology and psychology. So if you are a sociology or psychology teacher and you want to peruse those, you can. However, I'm going to mostly stick with these main 4. And today, in fact, I'm actually going to really focus on economics. I feel like I haven't really talked about that one too much yet, and so I'm going to go ahead and focus on that. But if you are a teacher of civics or geography or history, please feel free to be using those chapters instead. What we see here on page 35 is where our section will begin, and we even see our 4 subsections. And so these are 4 main ideas or concepts or just themes that the C3 designers really wanted to focus on, and we're going to go ahead and see those right now. So let's go ahead and jump down to page 35. And I will say, too, at any moment, if you want to pause me or rewind, please feel free to do so. That's what I like about videos. I know I'm a bit of a fast talker, especially, and so if you want to rewind at any point, feel free to do so. Or pause me and read these sections if you want to go more slowly and methodically. If you have the C3 framework out in front of you, either on paper or online, you should always feel free just to pause me. That's that really cool power of the video, is you can do it however you want. And so we have a section here on economics. It tells us, why economics is important. It gives us a little bit of a description as to what it is. And so if you are unfamiliar, feel free to read that. Or again, just pause me if you would like to read it just for your own enjoyment. I'm going to go ahead and skip it, though, because you could pause and read me if you like. And I want to really jump into what the subsections look like and what they're focused on. So again, we have this subsection called economic decision making. There's 3 other sections. And this is a core principle in economics that the C3 designers wanted students to explore. And we see they gave us a couple standards to do that. So elementary has their standards, secondary has theirs, and since we're doing the secondary video, we'll really focus on these. And to remind you, we have end of grade 8, end of grade 12, and so these are really middle school standards, these are high school, so if you're a 6 through 8 teacher, that's what you'd focus on. If you're a high school teacher, 9 through 12, this is what you would focus on. And I like how they're vertically aligned, like I said in other videos, because it gives us an idea of what we could be doing as a district, as a team. And I like that idea of teaching a lot better than just we all go into our individual classrooms and work by ourselves. I think teaching is a powerful experience, and the more people who are all working towards a similar goal, you're going to get just a lot more benefit from the students, or you're going to get a lot more growth from the students, which the community will benefit. So we have our standards here. We see that just like the other dimensions of the C3, it's pretty similar in the idea that they want high cognition. So that idea, they want students to do more than just, recall, memorize, take a test on a Friday just to forget everything over the weekend. They want students to explain things, analyze. They want students to actually use the concepts and skills that you've given them, those economic skills. They want students to evaluate too. So determine if something is good or not good enough, determine if something should be pursued harder or less so. We want students, especially in the high school, to be really thinking for themselves, answering those big open-ended questions that we've talked about in past videos. So as we scroll down, we see there's other sections, exchange and markets. We see there's quite a few standards here. And I think it's something that we're going to have to ask ourselves, is what do we want our students to actually do? And I remember talking to teachers and, doing activities with them. A lot of teachers want to focus on students becoming good citizens, preparing them for the future, having conversations with each other, talking about the community that they live in, the successes of the community, the things that are still problems they want to continue to work on. And we have to ask ourselves, do our current set of standards really push for that? And if not, then we could look at these standards and ask ourselves, is there something about these that we could incorporate that would potentially help students? But again, that's an open-ended question for teachers. How should we best do this? As we see, we have a lot of different examples. Some similar verbs, some new ones like generate pop up. And if I continue to scroll down, we see it's much of the same. And so I'm not going to spend too much more time on this because, again, you can scroll through it yourself. But I really would encourage you to do so, especially in your discipline, to see what C3 has to offer. But now we're going to jump into an actual lesson plan. I'm going to continue building that same unit plan that I've been building. I'm going to take some of these C3 concepts and put them into our lesson plan and see what we get. So where we last left off was this graph right here, the aligning questions with assessment graph. And as we can see, we haven't really changed anything since last time. We still have our bolded summative performance task right here, and we have our question that we did. And remember, in the last video, we really focused on how do we change the supporting question. And here in this faded area, we have what was the original work, where we had this supporting question, this stage, and then this formative performance task. And down here, we've changed it. And what we focused on was adding resilience and marginalization, because here we thought that the marginalization and the resilience that was a part of the summative task would need to be explained in one of these days. And the question about why were many Native American children given English names, it didn't really connect with this, so we went ahead and just changed it right here. So what we're going to do with the rest of this video is we're going to focus on the actual inquiry part that would help build up to this final summative performance task, and that can be seen with the staging the supporting question and the formative performance task. And both of these are really tasks or activities, and you can kind of see why. I'll go ahead and just read the first two final products. First one here, create a T-chart with one side that represents marginalization and the other resistance. For 5 minutes, use sensory words that characterize resistance and marginalization. Put these words in your own T-chart, or in your T-chart. So students have to create a T-chart for about 5 minutes, and they really have to think of like what marginalization and resistance means. And depending on the students, you might have to spend some time working with them on those definitions. Don't see this as a first thing you have to do. It's just something that we want to make sure that students do at some point, because they're going to use this T-chart in order to do like tomorrow's activity, and especially they're going to use it for this big summative performance task. Now let's go ahead and look at this first staging the supporting question. And again, we're going to do something very similar to what we did with the supporting question. We're going to look at our summative performance task and figure out how this information, which was based off our standards, including the C3 framework and the Ochetti-Sakowin essential understandings, how does all of this connect with this? So looking at our first one, we have for 5 minutes, write about the real people, places, and things that you and your family have to name. Use sensory language to describe why this process was important to you. Okay, and again, to remind you, I wrote this as a lesson, and so I can see why I wrote this. It's something that will engage students. It relates to something that they know. In fact, I think this is actually a still really good warm-up that you might want to do as part of this overall unit if you'd like to. However, I don't really think it does anything to connect to the summative performance task. I mean, I suppose I could say I could just make a T-chart of this information. I kind of said that, I could make a T-chart and talk about the sensory language. I kept that part down here and talk about the sensory language between marginalization and resistance. Actually, I can't do that because I didn't even include that in here. I think that's the point I'm trying to lead up to, is it had nothing to do with marginalization and resistance, and that's like the chief part of this compelling question, and so I changed it. And down here we can see that, and I'll bold these words to make it easier to see. I just added that information, but overall it didn't change that much. I kept the 5 minute part. I kept the sensory words part. And to remind you, the sensory words part comes from that English connection. That was the original idea, that we wanted to use sensory words, and I actually changed that originally to something else. In fact, if I scroll up, you might be able to see that lesson. Yeah, so remember here I had the ELA connection. That was a sensory word one, so I actually don't need that anymore, but you could still make an argument that you could keep it, and you could even add that to your English word. And I still think doing something like that will give students now some kind of work that they can take into this final summative performance task at the beginning. And also, it connects to what I did in the other pieces. And unfortunately, I won't have time to go through the green and red, but if you have time to look at it, you'll see that I actually mentioned the T-chart again right here. And then I think I keep on mentioning it. Yeah, so I keep on mentioning the T-chart. So this part one which connect, again, that's all this is right here, is part 1. And this is part 1, part 2, part 3. This T-chart that we're creating, I think I'm bolding right now, connects to part 2 and part 3. And the idea is students will be able to use that when they organize and use multiple pieces of evidence. So we can see how now students are practicing that organization. So that might be something that you want to grade. And that's the point that I want to bring up now, is you need to be able to grade any of these, or maybe the right word is assess. You need to be able to assess some of these verbs or some of these tasks that are in the summative performance task and actually help students understand like what they're trying to master. In this case, they need to organize evidence. All right, so that is that part right there where we're looking at how this part 1 connects. We have our T-chart. Let's go ahead and go back up and see what else I made the changes to. So we have the resistance and the marginalization. Let's go ahead and look at this one now. I think I covered all that. Review the following sources and identify... Actually, sorry, I messed up. I'll go up here first. The review, or the original one. Remember, this is an original lesson plan that I wrote, and I made changes. So let's see how I did that. So I wrote, review the following 2 sources and identify ways in which Native American culture, including names, was taken away as part of U.S. assimilation efforts. And that formative performance task, I think, is good because... there's a couple sources that students will have access to that, you'll give them. And in fact, the next video I talk about that is how do we find these sources. And students are thinking about like, okay, well, how did these sources tell me about the U.S. assimilation efforts? And that connects to the Acheti-Sakowin standard because I wanted them to focus on a American South Dakota idea, but I don't think it's very clear. And I kind of talked about that before, where that's why I wrote Ocheti-Sakowin in bold. So if I look down, you'll see how I fixed that. So same thing, review the following sources and identify ways in which Native American culture, including names, was taken away as part of the U.S. assimilation efforts. That part's exactly the same. And then I added the resistance part and ways that Native Americans resisted. And in fact, in front of you guys right now, I'll even say I could change Native American because it's not Native American. It's the Ocheti-Sakowin. I know for a fact those are the standards that I picked. And some people might think, well, that's kind of nitpicky, and maybe that's an argument you can make, but I would actually say it's good for our students to see that we're using these specific indigenous names that have been given these people, especially if we're talking about a specific group, which in this case we are. The best part is it connects to our standards. So that is, that's how we add richness. That's how we show our students that we are being considerate of different cultures, is by using that right language. So I just changed that just now. We're still including names, and it connects to our resilience and marginalization, and students will have to organize their findings into their T-charts. And so we can also see how all this stuff is connected. In the beginning, we have a resilience and marginalization, like definition or characterization. Maybe the teacher would just do that by presenting them on the whiteboard or a PowerPoint slide or something, where they're just giving them those characteristics. Then we're moving into a warm-up, an activity where students for a few minutes or 5 minutes have to think of sensory words. And that's a holdback from that English language arts standard that we had. But I still think it's really valuable here, so you could add that. So again, remember, we had our English language arts standard up here. This one's more about arguments, so I'll bold that. But I still think, having sensory words could be a cool thing, but at the same time, I could see you wanting to change it if you wanted to focus on something else. And then finally, after we get past that first T-chart, now we have an activity where students are actually looking at sources. They're looking at historical information. And because here we said the Ocheti-Sakowin, in fact, I could even change more, I just realized. I could say the Ocheti-Sakowin in South Dakota after the Civil War. And again, that's making it a little bit more obvious how we're connecting it here. And then, we're talking about resistance. And we already include the marginalization part because we have this taken away part. And then we have our product, the T-chart. And that T-chart is going to be used for the summative performance task, but if we scroll down to our part 2 and part 3, which are different days, we can see that T-chart coming in again. That is where we left off now. We have a complete set where we have a question, we have our staging the question, that warm up, and then we have our formative task. And that's represented by doing this right here, and it all connects to the summative performance task. And you need to do that 3 different times. Now, in a real unit plan, you might connect this to across a lot more days. It really depends on what you need. And that's why I say during these workshops, please bring in the materials that you already have, and we can actually work together on what this might look like. Just in some final notes, I think it's a good job to connect your tasks or your products with each other. That's why that T-chart keeps on showing up. But we see other products here too. Like right here, I wrote additional information on the T-chart, but I also wrote that the students will have debate notes on a discussion board because they're going to be debating one another. And then finally here too, we have 2 brief descriptions that center around a theme. And again, I describe what that actually looks like in these descriptions. So have some consistent materials that carry across the days, and maybe have also some like one-off things where students can like produce a written reflection or they can participate in a discussion. Now, the final part of doing any kind of work with inquiry is not only do we need to figure out these kind of verbs, but we need to figure out how we're going to assess them. And unfortunately, when you're building this from scratch, there really is no great way of doing that. And so I'm just going to show you how I do it when I'm actually building anything from scratch. I'm going to create a rubric, but I'm going to really work with my students in figuring out like what that rubric should look like. So let's just take this first part, organize and use multiple pieces of evidence. If I scroll down, we'll see a new chart where I said organize evidence, and you could even write organize multiple pieces of evidence. And I created 4 different sections for new columns: developing, emergent, proficient, and advanced. Whenever we're doing any kind of assessment work, we need to have multiple levels that students can perform at. Now, sometimes these things can be very concrete. You could write, for example, that students will use 1 piece of evidence from their past reflections. And then you can go all the way to advanced, where you expect them to use 4 pieces of evidence. That's a really concrete way of going about it. Now, if you want to get more abstract and kind of get into those deeper cognitive levels of like, how do you use evidence in order to build a really good argument, you might want to ask your students how they think it looks like. Or even better, give them an example of a really well done essay. Like somebody that, a student that you had last year, or even this year. You could even do something where you ask your language arts teacher for an example, and then you give that example to all your students, and you ask them, what about the evidence is organized well in this paper? And let students kind of brew on it. And as they do, let them come up with reasons and themes, either in small groups or as a whole class. And, I call them themes just now, so we'll just stick with that language. The students will fill in the rubric for you. And this does 2 things. First, it frees you up. This idea that the teacher has to do all this, extra work for the students, I don't like that idea. I think students should be working alongside you, and this is one way of doing that. Another great thing about it is it kind of automatically makes it where the rubric is set to what the students think they can achieve, things that they notice. And so you can do that around, a specific verb like organizing evidence, or you can go back to let's go back to this. You can go back to this in these bolded sections, and you can ask even students, hey, you bold the sections that you think are important and build this rubric. You can even make that an activity that if we go back to our, part 1, part 2, part 3, that could be an activity that goes across the different days where the students are adding to a rubric that I think would be really impressive. And probably the best thing about that is, 2 things. Again, you don't have to do all the work. You're saving yourself some time where you can actually do the thing you enjoy doing, teaching, and the students are actually getting to have their voice heard in the rubric. All right, so that is all the time we have for video 4, and just to reiterate, what we focused on was not only using our backwards design idea of going from standards to summative assessment to the actual supporting questions and then the inquiry types that we want to grade. We focus on organizing evidence and what that might look like, and we actually even talked about a rubric as well. If any of that stuff seems confusing or you'd want more explanation before our workshops, please email me. I'd be happy to help you. And remember, too, you have these documents, and so you can see this entire, before and after process. But I understand if you want me to fill in those gaps, then I'm happy to do it for you through email. All right, so we're on to our very last video. We're going to focus on how to actually look for sources and information, mostly online, and those things will automatically connect to all of the things that we've built, and then our students will be well prepared to do inquiry. And so until that last video, take care. Goodbye.